and welcome to the Whitney Raincoat Sew Along. Today I'm going to be showing you the Big Kahuna. We are talking about attaching the lining to the outer jacket. And this is known as a bagged lining technique, so you will find this helpful even if you're not necessarily sewing the Whitney Raincoat. The technique is very similar for most bagged linings. And so I have here, this is my outer jacket. It is flipped right side up, and then I have my lining here. And we are going to go ahead and get started. I am going to put my lining and my jacket right sides together, and I'm going to spin this around. Now you will notice that I don't use pins of any sort, which might make y'all a little nervous, but we're going to go for it. So I am starting at the hem, and I have my outer jacket with my zipper here, and I am going to connect my lining, and I am just going to sew all the way around the outer edges, not the hem yet. We're just going to sew all the way around the outer edges. And since we have a zipper to deal with, I have a narrower presser foot here, just so that I know when I'm sewing along this area, I'm not going to be hitting those teeth. If you don't have a narrow presser foot, you could also use a zipper foot as well. I'm going to put this on my lap because it doesn't want to all stay on my table here. When there's a lot of fabric going on like this, you really want to make sure the excess is out of the way and you're not catching a bunch of stuff. I'm going to use a Wonder Clip here because I can see that my facing is wanting to slide, since this is a super slippery fabric. And I want to make sure I can sort of ease that in there. When I get to my neckline, you want to make sure, if you have a hood or a collar, that everything is flipped away, you flipped down towards the garment. I'm going to pivot here and just keep sewing. If there's any seam lines you're supposed to be matching up, make sure you match those up. Here is my shoulder seam, and I want that to match with my shoulder seam underneath. You might have to slip your hand under the lining to make sure that everything is out of the way and lining up good. You don't want to catch any bits of your hood or anything like that. Make sure your center back seams are lined up. We're going through a lot of layers right now. As you can see, I'm just kind of maneuvering as I go. There's no reason you can't pin this if that makes you more comfortable. It is a little finicky. I just find pinning to take up a bit too much of my time. All right, we're in the home stretch. Well, home stretch of this part. Now on this side where we have our zipper pull, you may need to zip that up and past your needle once you're about halfway down, so you can get a nice connection close to those zipper teeth. Part 1 accomplished. Okay, I am going to clip my corners. I'm going to make a couple clips into my neckline. Be careful not to clip through your stitching. That was a weird underlining piece that was sticking up. And corners. Okay. Now, for many coats, if it's a blazer or something like that, your next step would be to open this up and understitch on the side of your lining. This is our facing, this is our lining. Understitch here, so you're catching the seam allowance underneath, and you would do that all the way up the opening and then all the way around the neckline as well. And that would keep your neckline looking nice and clean and faced to the inside. However, since this is a raincoat and typically we are dealing with much heavier fabrics that really want to pop up on us, not lay flat, I am going to top stitch all the way around instead of understitching. And I'm going to make sure all of my corners are turned out real nicely. And I am going to start, since this is a top stitch, I'm going to make sure that I have the top facing me. I'm still using my narrower foot. And I am going to sort of, as I'm sewing this, I'm going to pull both of my fabrics away from my zipper or my collars or whatever it is, so that everything underneath and everything on top is really crisp against that seam. And when I am doing this top stitching, I am just going to start from the bottom of my zipper because I need this bottom open to be open for whenever we're dealing with the hem. And it's especially important to make sure you're pulling the underneath. Since you can't see it, you don't want this facing to sort of sneak its way out and get caught in your stitching to where you have some weirdness there. You want to make sure everything is nice and clean looking. And if it helps, you can understitch first, see how it looks. You might, if you have a lighter fabric or a fabric that doesn't want to bounce at you, you might not need the top stitching and you might just do the understitching, or understitching might help you to be able to do your top stitching a little bit neater. And again, I want my hood and my collar to be pushed away. And I've got my hand underneath so I can make sure to pull the lining down away from the seam. A little trickier as we go over this laminated cotton. Pivoting again. Again, we are pulling both the top and underneath away from the zipper. And again, we are only going to the bottom of the zipper. Okay, now as you can see, I have a nice stitching. Everything next to my zipper is stitched flat and out of the way, on top and underneath. And the same goes for my facing, is all stitched down. On the side, everything is looking really nice. Okay, so our next step is I'm going to head to the iron and press up all of my seam allowances. In this case, my seam allowances are 1.5 inches, and pressing those up and having that clear crease around the bottom is really going to help us in some of the next steps. Okay, so we have pressed up our hems, and I forgot to mention this earlier, you do not need to press up the lining hem, just the outer hem. And I've done it on our sleeve as well. You can see our crease here. And the next thing we are going to do is the sleeve hem. So you want your lining sleeve to be slipped up inside your outer sleeve, and you want to make sure that the underarm seams are matched up and that your sleeve is not twisted around on the inside. Everything is nice and straight. And the next thing you're gonna do is slip your hand up through the sleeve. So I am in between the sleeve and the lining. And those seam allowances are still lining up. And I'm going to grab the ends of the sleeve at the seam allowance part. Make sure that those seam allowances stay lined up. Flip those inside, grab a hold of them, and pull them out so that we have sleeve and lining separate, pulled out from the inside of the jacket. And don't get anything twisted. Keep a hold of your underarms. And then we're going to flatten these out. This part is a bit finicky, making sure our underarm seams are still matched up, and that is where I'm going to start my stitching. And I'm going to stitch at my 1/2 inch seam allowance from the edge all the way around. And as you can see, I'm slowly kind of working this around so that I have a nice straight shot to stitch on here. And I find it easier to stitch with the lining facing me and the outer side underneath. And these are right sides together. Back stitch whenever you meet up with your original stitching. Now it looks twisted and crazy right now, but do not fear. When you go back to the outside, slip your hand in the sleeve and pull that back right side out. You should have a nice connected sleeve to lining, and that's gonna fold up nicely right where we pressed it and look really good. Now what I like to do is do a stitch in the ditch right at the underarm seam, just the length, just like an inch or so up to where the lining is, and that's gonna hold that lining, or that's gonna hold that sleeve fold in place. And if we were doing a tailored jacket, we would stick our arm in between. I actually like to hold this fold in place and shove it back out. And we would, so up inside my sleeve, I'm holding that seam fold in place that we pressed earlier. And we would blind stitch all the way around to keep the lining from wanting to pull away and to keep that sleeve hem from wanting to sag. Now with a raincoat, your fabric may not allow for that. If it is coated or laminated, it may be hard to catch those little stitches in order to do the blind stitching. This is a laminated cotton. I think I might be able to do the blind stitching, but another quick and easy fix whenever you have a fabric that might be weird to blind stitch is I'm going to cut a little bit of this double-sided fusible hem tape and press it up, line it up in between the outer fabric. You can see my crease here, so I'm folding at the crease, and I'm just going to press this so that the hem is fused in place. And we already did that stitch in the ditch on our underarm seam. This is such a small circumference of a sleeve, so we really just need another piece on the outer side of the sleeve right here. So I'm going to press that in place. Okay, now that the sleeves are mostly done, we're going to flip this inside out, and we're going to stitch the hem. And normally, well, what the instructions are going to tell you to do, this is our facing here, is to stitch 1/2 inch all the way around. But what I like to do is at the beginning, and this is a little insider tip for you, a little pro tip, at the beginning, and I'm folding my seam allowance towards the facing. And I am going to start 1.5 inches up, which is right where my fold is. And what this is going to do is give me a nice crisp line right at the opening of the raincoat. If you stitch it at 1/2 inch, that is also totally fine. It's going to get folded right side out. It's going to get folded up inside here. So you'll have this 1/2 inch stitching up in here. And when you press it, it's going to look nice, but this is going to be open still. So by starting at your 1.5 inch fold, we're creating a seam right here across the facing. But we don't want our seam to be right on the fold around the whole jacket. That's just not how a lined jacket is meant to be. So I'm going to mark that 1.5 inches over here as well, so that whenever we get to this side, I can lead back up to that 1.5 inches. And starting back on this end here, I am starting at that 1.5 inch mark. I've got my seam allowance folded to the inside, and I'm gonna go straight across my 1.5 inches across this whole facing piece. And once I get past where my facing meets my lining, I'm gonna gradually slide out to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then we're just gonna stitch at a 1/2 inch all the way around. Make sure whatever seams that need to be matched up are matching up. In this particular instance, the center back seam of the lining should match up with this center back notch of the pleat piece. As I'm nearing my other facing piece, I am going to shimmy back up to that 1.5 inch mark and stitch straight across my facing. Again, I'm folding this facing seam allowance in towards the facing and back stitching. And we want this to be very neat, so I'm going to trim that, and I'm going to trim this. Before we turn our coat right side out, we want to tack this fold in place as well. And again, the couture method is you would blind stitch by hand all the way around, folding this up. But again, if your fabric doesn't call for that, we are going to use the fusible tape, and I am just going to press that in between these two layers, which is going to hold the fold in place. You can also do a hand stitch at each seam allowance meeting, but that's not going to be quite enough to keep the pieces in between the seam allowances from sagging down, and we really don't want that hem to sag. So we pressed this fold in place earlier so that I have a clear identification of where my hem is as I'm using my fusible hem tape. Okay, so once you are done securing your hem in place with either your fusible interfacing or your blind stitch. I actually ended up blind stitching this one because since I backed it with muslin, I was able to catch into that fabric. So you can see I just blind stitched the hem in place, and I can feel under here that that hem fold is nice and secure where we pressed it. And so now I know that as I'm wearing the coat, this hem is not going to want to fall away and create sort of a bubbled look. That folded hem will stay nice and crisp. Now it is time to turn the coat inside out, or right side out. So for this method, we are flipping the coat right side out through the opening that we left in the lining side seam. You may find for other bagged coat methods you leave an opening in the hem. This is also very common. However, since we are going to need to be slip stitching this opening closed, again, it's a little bit easier to work with the softer lining fabric than it would be to slip stitch into a coated raincoat fabric. That could be appropriate for a coat in a wool or something soft that you are really able to catch your thread with the needle. However, we are going to be flipping ours through this hole that we left in the side seam, which is also another very common way to do a bagged lining. So just reach in your hole, and I like to grab onto the collar as a starting point, and we are going to birth our coat. This is always a fun and exciting part because we are almost done and we can see what it all looks like. It's gonna look like a mess at first, but just flip it out. Give it a shake. Make sure your sleeves are pushed up, the lining sleeves are pushed up into the outer sleeves. And we have a beautiful, cleanly finished, lined coat. This is what that front edge looks like here. And now all we have to do is close up this hole. If you want this to be super clean and invisible, you would slip stitch this by hand. But everyone knows that I am a #lazy sewist, and I like to just fold this at the seam and do a top stitch in a matching thread, of course. Now, if you are working with a coat where your lining opening is in the hem, you won't be able to do a top stitch like this. You will definitely want to slip stitch it closed. And there you have it. We have a nice, clean, enclosed lining, and we have practically finished our raincoat. And that is how you do a bagged lining. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to message me or let me know in the comments below. Do check out the rest of my sew along videos. I think you will find them very helpful. And I do hope you love the Whitney raincoat as much as I do. And I hope you have a lot of fun sewing this pattern. Thanks so much for joining me, and happy sewing. Bye-bye.